Hey, if you've just parachuted in, or you are new or newer, we're in a series for the last couple of months. We've been talking about grace. When we're talking about grace, what does it do? Where do we find it? What are its promises? How do we experience its power? And then we've kind of transitioned into asking this question, what does it look like when grace flows from us? And last week I tried to wade into those somewhat messy and turbulent waters where the stream of the church flows into our cultural pond, and we started talking about sexual identity and grace and truth and engaging the LGBTQ community, and tried to kind of frame that conversation biblically, tried to help you begin to think, what does it look like to speak truth, to give grace, to speak words of love, and try to establish a foundation that hopefully, that buzz is so annoying. Don't know where it's coming from. Can you mute everything else other than me? Does that help? Everything else is muted? Okay. We'll just deal with it. Sorry. And I wanted you to see that on the macro scale, the big picture story of the Bible, that we are so similar. Like, in fact, we struggle with the same rebellion against God, to be autonomous and to define ourselves by our own selves, and we value personal freedom and calling our own shots and saying what's what. We all carry the same, but in the micro scale, our story, our backstories are all a bit unique, and there's varying degrees of brokenness in each of our story. But the common denominator is that we've all experienced brokenness and sin, and that's the way the Bible deals with this whole issue, is that we're all on the same plane with varying degrees of brokenness, but we all experience brokenness. And so the inclusivity of God is radical in that Christ comes and He says, I got an extra hour of sleep too, which is makes no sense. Christ said, whoever would believe. And then Jesus goes and He says to His followers, you want to know what it's like to track with God? You want to know what it's like to live into His will? I want to make it so simple with you. I want you to love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind. Right? The thing that drives your will, I want that to be God-shaped. The thing that drives your thinking, I want that to be truth-shaped. The thing that drives your hunger and your appetites and your soul, I want that to terminate on God. And the second thing is like it. I want you to love your neighbor. And in that command, there is no exemption. There's no subcategory or subgenre of culture that is outside the command to love our neighbor. And so we need to figure out in this very, very turbulent and messy place of trying to live in the tension between truth and grace, what does it mean like to love our neighbors if they happen to be part of the LGBTQ community? And get me, hear me out, it's messy. I had a whole bunch of people coming up here and talking to me after service last week, and people emailing me questions, and there's a whole bunch of I'm like, yeah, I get that, yeah, but, and yeah, I get that, all the messy stuff, I get that. But when Jesus says love your neighbor, He means it. He means it. And He thinks we're capable of doing it. And so today I want to kind of transition out of some of the biblical foundation of culture and society and brokenness and culture and different expressions of culture. And I want to get just really, really practical and really simple. And I'm going to take one story of Jesus, which is a bit of an example for us to look like, what does it look like to see grace and truth in action? That'll be found in John chapter 4. Before we get there, you can open up to John chapter 1, because there's a very, very important principle that you will miss the incredibleness of John chapter 4 if you miss this little truth in John chapter 1. But before we get there, I need to tell you a story while you're turning to John 1. If you know me, if you've heard me preach, you know that I love history. I love 20th century history. I especially love war history, especially the First and Second World War. If I'm watching television and there's a black and white, footage of a German Panzer or a British Spitfire, I'm like, don't change the channel, the remote goes down, and I just watch for the next hour, whatever it is. I've read tons and tons about the First World War. I've read, all kinds of really vivid descriptions of what the trenches were like and trench warfare and the horror of that and the death that was all around. I've read vivid descriptions of, rats out feeding on the mangled corpses of young men who were thrown into the meat grinder of no man's land. I've read about that. Horrible stuff. I've seen black and white pictures, and you've probably seen them too, of skeleton trees and big crater holes where shells have kind of blown these big holes where there's filled with slime and water and half-buried bodies. I've seen that, and you've seen it too. And I know a bunch of the stats, and you might know a bunch of the stats. Stats that are I can understand the numbers, but I cannot conceive the truth behind these numbers. Like, for example, do you know that there was more Frenchmen killed in the first 3 weeks of the First World War than in all the Napoleonic Wars combined? Decades of warfare. The first day of battle, 27,000 Frenchmen were killed. Just pause and imagine if in a single day, 27,000 young Canadian boys were killed. And 27,000 letters go out to 27,000 families who are utterly devastated. And then the next day it's 35. And the next day it's 32. And the next day it's 41. And it just keeps happening over and over again. 848,000 casualties at Passchendaele. 1.2 million casualties at the Somme. It's why we wear this, because the numbers are so horrific. And here's the deal. History books, black and white photographs, stats can help me understand something of the truth. But the reality is I can't really feel that truth from 40,000 feet up. I can't really, empathize with that through the pages of a book. That's why I so deeply appreciated this one war museum I went to in Europe. Because they did things differently. Instead of having the typical old artifacts and black and white pictures with, write-ups about what was happening on the wall, they had this elaborate First World War trench built that you entered. And it was like dirt and mud, and the lights were kind of low, and they had like a smoke machine, so it was like kind of foggy and smoky and kind of creepy, and they'd have like a soundtrack playing and like surround sound. You'd hear guys kind of, breathing hard and some guys moaning, and then you'd hear the big booming concussion of shells. And if you wanted to look over the side of the trench into no man's land or over to the enemy lines, you had to look through this weird periscope thing, which was super annoying. It was so hard to see. And if you tried to peek your head up, if you got it above the trench, you'd hear like a gunshot of a sniper bullet ring out at you. And it was intense. And they actually somehow, by getting us into the trench, getting us down at ground level, getting us eye level, it was like I felt more of the truth in that moment of what it was really like than all the stats and all the black and white pictures and all the descriptions and all the history books I've read. Now, what in the world does that have to do with our conversation of grace and truth? Nothing. I just like talking. No, it does. It actually does have something to do with our conversation. Here's the deal. I think the gospel call on your life, if you are a Christ follower, is to get into the trenches of people's lives. To get up close. To feel and empathize their story, their frustrations, their hopes. For you to be vulnerable with your own shortcomings and your own flaws, that you would lead with your own transparency. You'd be honest about the truth about yourself and not just speak truth about Jesus. Because when we do that, it allows trust to grow. It allows honest conversation to build. And that is the habitat. That is the environment where grace and truth flourish. In the trenches, eye level. Now, some Christians I know, none of you of course, but some Christians that I know think that, the importance is just getting the truth out there. Just get the truth out there. I don't care whether it's on a billboard or somebody on a street corner shouting, or if it's 140 characters or less and you do it in all caps. Just get the truth out there. What's important is that it gets out there. How it gets out there is not important. And I would say to you that is emphatically wrong. And God would say that is emphatically wrong. And you know how I know that? John chapter 1. God could have communicated truth. He could have delivered it from a distance. He could have, boomed a voice like this. Hey, Fernie, this is God. He could have done that. He could have wrote it across the sky in such a way that it caused us all to stop in our tracks and make us all feel puny and small and make him seem big and glorious. He could have communicated truth that way. He could have dropped truth bombs from 40,000 feet on us. And that is not the way that God chose to bring truth into the world. In fact, we read in John 1:14 these staggering words. The Word, the eternal Word, the eternal purpose that is God Himself, became flesh. And He made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. When God delivers grace and truth, He does it by hand. He hand delivers it. God's method to bring grace and truth is to come up to our house and ring the doorbell and pass it through that way. That is how God delivers grace and truth. He got inside our skin, got inside our minds, inside our experience and inside our story, where He could live our longings and also live our frustrations. And this is so huge. This is so huge. That's why I get so frustrated when people say religions are all the same. I'm like, no, they're not. Because nobody would think of this. That God became one of us and got into the muddy trench of our story, got right down to ground level where He could be eye to eye with us, where He would empathize with us and speak with us right at where we're at. God's best delivery of truth, John says, does not come from 40,000 feet up in cold decrees, but face to face as a guy living our story. God with us as a man, born into the trenches of our humanity. God come to live and breathe and love and cry and hurt and suffer and wound and bleed and hope. One of us. Why did God do that? Because truth and grace are best given and best received within touching distance. Because truth is best heard and best received within earshot. When eyes lock eyes, life to life, one human soul to another. Now let me just kind of pause here and just, maybe this isn't you, so you can just ignore this whole part. But what that means, hear me Christians, what that means, because I'm friends with a bunch of you on Facebook, and I see some of the stuff that you write. What that means is that truth and grace is not bombed digitally. In fact, there's something, Mary Shire showed me a Facebook post that was this public thread conversation between a Christian and some of his family members who were talking about, faith and sexuality and the whole LGBTQ issue. And they were clearly on different sides of the issue. And it only took probably 4 threads, 4 back and forth in this conversation for things to get nasty, unbelievably nasty, and unbelievably ugly. Because there's something that digitally happens to truth and grace. It gets auto-corrected to arrogance and insults. Truth and grace came in the flesh. It tented among us. It moved in down the block. It was our neighbor. It rang the doorbell. It spoke eye to eye in the trenches of our humanity. So when we go into this, and as people who are meant to be stewards of truth and grace, we don't pat ourselves on the back because we write digital memos and we blast it out there. That's not the way of God. The Word became flesh. And it moved in down the block. And it lived with us. Now, God thinks that that's the way that truth and grace comes to humanity. And in fact, just so you understand how radical that is, Jesus didn't show up Christmas Day and then Boxing Day he launched the Grace and Truth Tour, coming to a city near you. He didn't do that. What did he do? He spent 30 years living with us. 30 years working. 30 years side by side of all kinds of people. 30 years figuring out what does it look like to try to follow God on the job site. What does it look like to follow God when your back is sore? What does it look like to follow God when your family is kind of half crazy? What does that look like? What does it look like to walk with people through the whole experience of humanity? To laugh, to love, to grieve, to cry, to get angry, all that stuff he experienced. Jesus is purposefully experiencing all that. And the reason why I know this is so important, that empathy would be in Christ, that Jesus goes and gets baptized by John the Baptist. I'm getting all fired up here. Jesus gets baptized by John the Baptist, and he's going to go start his public ministry where he gives grace and proclaims truth. And the first thing the Spirit of God does when he's about to start his ministry, what is the first thing the Spirit of God leads Jesus to go do? To go where? Desert. Into the desert for 40 days, where God is going to let Satan loose on Jesus. To go at him, to tempt him with the very same things that our autonomous souls are tempted with. The temptation to pursue comfort over what is right. The temptation to say yes to his own autonomy and no to God. The temptation to have glory through a way that's self-aggrandizing. Jesus was tempted with all of those things. Now, why would the Spirit of God do that? Why would he say, okay, Jesus, you're about to preach truth, but first you go into the wilderness where I'm going to unleash a wolf on you? Why would he do that? And listen, you need to grab this. It was so that Jesus could empathize with us. So that grace and truth aren't proclaimed from a sterile life, detached from the reality on the ground. God became flesh so that he could extend grace and truth in callous, marked hands that look so much like ours. And if you don't believe me, then what are you going to do with this? Hebrews chapter 2. For this reason, Jesus had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that, this is a staggering sentence, he might become. Become is a process word. So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. That he might make atonement for the sins of people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Being made human made Jesus merciful and gracious because he felt our pain, lived our story, experienced it himself, and he became merciful, which is a mind-blowing statement. He became merciful and he became a faithful high priest. A high priest is one who advocates between God and the people and speaks truth to the people. He became that. Why? How? Grace and truth became even more urgent and potent in Jesus because he got eye to eye with us, heard our story, shared our humanity, saw our pain, empathized with our plight and our experiences, and our need for both grace and truth. That is what made Jesus' ministry so powerful, so magnetic, so real, and so relatable. And John is going to show us that truth of John 1:14 in all these stories. He's going to unpack all these stories where you see, what does it look like that God became flesh and he came full of grace and truth? What does that look like when he bumps up the people who need grace and people who are living their lives far from truth? What does that look like? And I'm going to grab one from John chapter 4. And I'm not going to linearly lay this kind of out and this, but I'm hoping that you're going to see some of the heart of Jesus here that we can grab if we want to grow to become a people who love our neighbors in truth and grace well. John chapter 4. So John chapter 4, Jesus is on this road trip with his disciples. Things are getting hot in Judea. He's getting all kinds of opposition, so he's going to lie low, and he's going to head back to the Galilee where he can kind of just get his head down and kind of lie low and let things calm down for a bit. And on his way from Judea here, your map, to Galilee here, he goes through Samaria over here, which is like a detour, and it's not the way that you would go. In fact, to try to help you understand how this is a strange way for Jesus to go, it'd be like good religious folks, after church, you live in a big city, and you're going to head back home to your house in suburbia, and you load up the kids, and instead of going straight home, you take the detour, and you drive through the red light district. Or, even better, you drive through kind of the gay quarter, where everything's rainbow, it's the LGBTQ headquarters, you drive through there. See, you should see in this story that Samaritans, Jews, they don't mix well, they don't interact. It's an us and them. They got their group, we got our group, we don't talk, we don't cross paths, we don't get along. That's what you should see. And Jesus comes to this well with his disciples outside the town of Sychar. He sends his disciples into town to go get some food, and Jesus hangs out there all by himself. He's like, no, I'm just going to stick around here, and it's going to get hotter and hotter, and I'm going to sit around here getting thirstier and thirstier. And John says that at noon, a woman shows up. Now, this is strategic for her. She's coming at noon, which is the hottest part of the day. The sun is right overhead. She's coming there because she knows that nobody else wants to carry and lug water at the hottest part of the day. They're going to go there in the morning. They need the water for the morning. So they're going to go there early when it's cool. And so it's going to be alone. She wants to be alone. She doesn't want to interact with people. That's a very negative thing to her. She'll take the blistering heat at noon over the icy stares and the hushed whispers and the muffled laughs that are laced with disdain that come to her from the other women. She'll take that. And I imagine, if you kind of let the movie run out in your mind, I imagine her working her way down the path towards the well, and she stops because there's a guy sitting there on the edge of the well. And clearly by his clothes, she can tell that he's Jewish. He's not from around here. And so you need to know at this point that Jews loathed Samaritans. There was all this cultural baggage between the two groups. The Samaritans had kind of hijacked some aspects of the Jewish faith, and the Jews felt like they bastardized it and they changed it. And so they hated Samaritans. Like they just oil and water. And so she pauses, in my mind, I imagine that she probably pauses and she considers maybe going back home because she wants to be alone, and the last thing she wants to do is like an encounter with a Jewish guy because he's going to probably heap disdain or scorn or whatever on her. But she decides to keep going because she's thirsty. She's thirsty. She needs the water. And she probably averts her eyes and pulls the scarf up over her face, and she gets the rope and she ties it to the handle of her jar, and she drops it 100 feet down into the water, and she hears it splash down there. And as she cranks it back up, she can probably feel the coolness of the water come up. And he speaks to her. This man speaks to her and he says this, "Will you give me a drink?" Now, we read that, and it's so easy for us just to get into the story, but I want you to pause right there. Because there's something that I think is easy to miss, but is so important that I want you to see in that statement the unguarded vulnerability of Jesus. He's crossing all kinds of lines. He's crossing all kinds of boundaries, all kinds of taboos, especially the fact that we'll later learn that he knows her backstory, he knows her lifestyle and her reputation. Him talking to a woman of that repute could get a ton of finger wagging from good religious people if they see that. They could assume the worst. This could go really, really bad for Jesus. And not only that, he's asking her for help. He's putting himself at a place of vulnerability, asking for her help, and she could easily turn him down, reject him. And here's what, this is a sidebar, but this is what I absolutely believe. I believe that Jesus sent the disciples into the town, that he would sit there with the day getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter so he could feel the parchedness of his throat, so that he would thirst, so he could empathize with this thirsty woman's soul. Because that's what Jesus does. He gets eye to eye with us. Well, the woman's startled and confused. And she says this, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask me, for a Samaritan woman, for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." If I could culturally translate this kind of into our series, it wouldn't be that far off to translate it like this. How is it that you, a Bible-believing Christian, cares about, is interested in me, a lesbian woman? How is that? Because we're an us and them. We're in two different groups. We don't cross paths. Everything culturally says we don't really like each other that much. What is it? Why are you talking to me? The context here is not all that different. And here's the one thing, man, I've just been moved so much this week that I just love about Jesus. I love that Jesus gets eye to eye with her, and he doesn't see the label. He doesn't see the category. He isn't put off by her past and her struggles. He sees her, a thirsty woman who needs to know the love and experience the grace of God. He didn't see her as somebody as a work project or somebody whose lifestyle made him uncomfortable. He saw her humanity, her thirst, her need. Oh, that God would move. That God would move in me and in you, that we would see people. Not the labels and the letters. We see people. Their shared humanity. Their shared thirst. Their shared value. Like Jesus does. How is it that you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. I picture Jesus here in the little movie in my mind. I picture Jesus kind of, shake his head slowly, and he sighs and he rests his eyes on hers. And his eyes are kind, and they're compassionate, and they're inquisitive. Because he can just see. It's like he just sees into her, the thirst inside her. And Jesus says this, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that asked you for a drink, you would have asked him that he'd given you living water. Now she's kind of taken back because he's speaking with sincerity and compassion, and it's like he really, really wants to help her. It's like he really wants to offer her something, some true service, but she stumbles over the metaphor, and to top that all off, she's been fooled by guys before saying, kind words to her. She knows in her story where that goes. And so she's guarded and she's confused, and it doesn't make sense. He doesn't even have a rope. Like, how can he offer me any water of any kind? And so she says, "Sir," she sets down the jug in front of him. "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where will you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well?" And here's where I see Jesus pause, because Jesus always seems to do that. He pauses before he's got the beautiful punchline of grace. He pauses, and in my mind, he takes a big drink, and he puts the jug down, and he looks at her and he smiles and he says this, "Whoever drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give will become a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And I want you to see here that when Jesus speaks to her, he leads with words of grace. Words of grace. "I offer it to you right here, right now, that which can satisfy your soul, that which you have been longing for your whole life. I have it, I'll give it to you." Now her mind is trying to process all this, and she probably picks up her jug and heads out to leave, but there's something about him. It's not just the sincere way that he spoke and the kindness of her eyes. It was like, as he said these words, it's like a small glimmer of hope trickled down into her parched soul. And she comes back and she says to him, "Sir, give me this water so I too won't get thirsty." She's primed for grace. Now watch Jesus lead with the left foot of truth now. Go call your husband and come back. And at this, I just imagine this trance of hopefulness in her is just broken. And I imagine her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and shame underneath her scarf. And she says, I have no husband. Her lips probably trembling. She's probably biting it to keep it from trembling. And Jesus says this, you have answered well. You've had 5 husbands, and the man that you now have is not your husband. You have spoken truthfully. And in the movie in my head, which is always maybe more dramatic than in real life, this is the way it goes in my head. In the movie in my head, she drops the water jug and she's totally taken back. How does he know? How does this foreigner know? Is the gossip about her so common knowledge that even this guy knows her backstory? Can she not escape the shame of her past from even this guy from another land? So the question is this. While she feels shame that comes into her from the reminder of the truth of her back story, he doesn't berate her or condemn her. It's like he only saw her, he comprehended her, he knew her, and he saw her thirst. And so the question is this, now why would Jesus do this? Why, as he's offering grace, would he bring up the truth of her story and her pain and her mistakes and her flaws? Why would he do that? And here's what I think the answer is. I think Jesus did that so that she would know that the grace that's being offered her was for all of it. That she wouldn't somehow receive what this guy is offering, but in the back of her mind thinks, well, if he only knew. You know, there's got to be an exemption clause in this whole living water thing from my backstory, and if he knew it, I'd be disqualified. It would be void. Jesus draws the truth out of her so that she would see that nothing in her or her story voids his grace. The one doesn't override the other. The grace of God comes into and perfectly covers the truth of who she is. Jesus wanted her to know that God, wasn't put off by what she had done. So he didn't shake his finger at her. He didn't give her a dressing down. He just wanted her to be honest, to own her own story, not to keep it from her. But he's drawing her by the truth of her story deeper into the reality of his grace. That's what he's doing. And listen, it is hard for us to own our story. It's the only thing more difficult than owning your story is spending the rest of your life running from it. You can own your story before God. And that doesn't put you in a different category. That doesn't exclude you from his words of grace. It doesn't change it. It doesn't change how loud and enthusiastic Jesus proclaims grace over your life. You can own your story. Well, she does, but she's unnerved at this point. She's unnerved by this guy's knowledge. She's unnerved by the kind of the pain of her backstory, what it brings up with her, and she concludes that he must be a prophet. And so she does what Christian folks like to do when Jesus starts pushing in too close to our hearts, or Christians start pushing too close into our hearts. She wants to talk theology. That's what we do. Let's not talk about this, let's talk about this. And so she tries to start up a theological conversation with Jesus, and Jesus won't go for it. In a simple word, he takes her bad theology and he gives her good theology and he presses right back in here. And she says this, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. And Jesus declared, I who am speaking to you am he. I don't know if you know this. This is the first time that Jesus tells somebody who he is. Do you know that? And he doesn't do it to a Jew. He doesn't go find, the guy who got the most gold stars in his devotion to God and say, you have been so good, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. He picks a woman, a Samaritan woman, with such a broken backstory that she's too ashamed to even mingle with people at the well. And he gives it to her. She's the first one, the first human who knows that they are locking eyes on the one who has been foretold for thousands of years, the one who Israel has been hoping for and praying for and singing about and waiting to come. She's the first person who knows that. Now, why would God give it to her? Because the truth and grace that he was speaking to her was so powerful that he wanted her to know that the Messiah was for her, that God saw her, that God knew her, that God knows her need, and that God is meeting with her. And maybe a secondary reason is so that we could find ourselves in this woman's broken story and see that Jesus wants to show himself to us too. That there's nobody that we can run through the slideshow of our mind. There's no face that we can run through for the people we deal with that Jesus does not want to say, I'm he. I'm the one you've been waiting for. I'm the one that's promised. I'm the one who has what your soul needs. Matt reminded me of something this week. We were talking about this encounter. Something I didn't see before, but something I'll never unsee now. He said, I love how when Jesus talks with this lady, he isn't driving her to a new morality. He's driving her to himself. See, that's what Jesus is after her. Jesus isn't trying to take some moral framework and swap it out for another moral framework. He wants to bring thirsty people to himself and fill them with life. And let water fill them and water flow out of them. And let how that washes out and how that shapes and how that directs and how, let that all come after. So, I'm going to wrap up here. This is what I'm hoping, maybe if I can recap in this story, if you can grab some touch points. First thing I hope that you see is that God's vehicle of truth and grace, they're delivered life to life, eye to eye, this far apart. Not bombed from on high, not trying to get people to watch sermons from some people they don't know. It's from one soul to another soul speaking. That's how God gave truth. And that's why God imparted truth to you and I, so that we would be in the trenches with people, empathizing with their story, leading with the truth of our own brokenness and our own need, and then leading with words of grace for them to draw out their truth so that we can match it with the reality of God's encompassing grace. First thing. Second thing is that Jesus made himself vulnerable. And we need to lead at that. He positions himself where he will have an encounter with this woman, and he didn't care what people would say, and he didn't care that she was one of those, and you're one of those, and we don't talk and we don't mix, and people are going to talk, and people are going to think, and people are going to look down on you, and people are going to wag their finger, and people are going to gossip, and he didn't care about any of that. He just met her where she was at. He saw her dignity, and he saw her value, and he led with words of grace. You know, the other incredible thing, just to bring this all home, is that the same living water that Jesus promised this woman, he declares is in each one of us who are his followers. It's his Spirit. And he says, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to surrender your life to me, that I'm going to so fill you with my life and my Spirit, it's going to spill out of you. And what that means is that people who are thirsty, like this woman, are going to be able to come to us and understand some of the living water that God has through the truth and grace that we give and we proclaim. Not that the grace is ours, not that the truth is ours, but we're just one thirsty person who's received it and pointing somebody to where they can find it. That's the genius of the way God chooses to operate. He doesn't give truth from afar. He puts it in us, and he sends us into the trenches of people's humanity. And he says, I want you to love your neighbor wherever they are, whatever label they have, whatever title, however they self-identify. I want you to love them. I want you to meet their needs. I want you to lead with truth about your own flaws and brokenness. And I want to use that as the means by which you talk about my grace. I have so far to go in this, man. I got all kinds of fear, and I got all kinds of issues, and I got all kinds of selfishness, and I got all kinds of pride, and I got all kinds of these sponges on unlovableness and unlovingness that sucks up this water. I got all these dams that kind of cause it to just barely trickle out of me. Here's the deal. If you hear Jesus is calling you to both come and drink, you can come and ask him and he'll put his life in you. And if you're a Christian and you're like, man, I haven't been leading with much truth or much grace, there's not a whole lot of refreshing water that comes out of me. In fact, everything's pretty stagnant around me. And here's the key, that Jesus has come and just repent of that. And repentance is like it blows open those dams so that where we've grieved or quenched or hindered his spirit, it begins to flow out of us. May it be true of us. May this place get messier and messier. Amen. May we trip over the inconsistency of trying to walk in grace and truth. May we struggle through that, and may we make mistakes, and may we have this people say, you're not consistent here, and how come you didn't do here, and you're soft here, and may that all happen, because if that all happens, that means we're probably somewhere in that sweet spot of tension between grace and truth. It probably means we're pointing people to Jesus and letting him take care of the stuff that only Jesus can take care of. We can love our neighbor, give grace, speak truth. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for including this encounter with this woman in your story. And I know there were so many hundreds and thousands of encounters you had with people that you could pick so many. I'm so grateful you picked this one. Because I can find myself in this woman. And I can find myself fully cognizant and aware of my flaws and my past and my mistakes and the shame that I carry. And I too know that shame can lead to isolation, where this woman has to go by herself. And I thank you, Jesus, that you push in to our isolation. I would ask God that you would give us a growing understanding of how complete your grace is for us, and shape us into a people who are truly able to follow your Spirit's lead, to see where your Spirit is flowing out of us, to follow it, that water which always flows to the lowest place, and that we would speak truth lovingly like Jesus did, in a way that's real and relatable, that's vulnerable and honest, that's magnetic and life-changing like Jesus was. God, would you help us do that? In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, thanks for listening.